Welcome, class. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe and sane. Today's lecture should be pretty brief. This is typically a day that doesn't require full class time, and because we will have zero discussion, since it's just me talking, we should be able to get through this content in no time flat, which I think should be good news to you, because I'm sure that you want to devote time to completing tasks from last class if they're not completed. Excuse me, working on your storyboards, and also thinking about your personal narrative, what you're going to write about, and maybe just getting some ideas together for that. So let's get started. Today we will talk about how we define audience and purpose. So our objectives today are going to be obviously understanding what audience and purpose are all about, different ways that you can critically approach your understanding of these concepts to basically amplify the use of rhetoric in your writing. For next class, I'm going to have you read Beauty When the Other Dancer is the Self and The Chase. I also want to mention that I decided that in order to keep attendance, since I'm not doing the live face-to-face meetings, which I hope you are appreciative of, because I'm being told now by my other students that basically all of your classes are being held live and it's become pretty tedious and difficult to navigate. We're going to try to keep things much easier here. A lot of stuff we'll do will be kind of work on your own in your own time, with a few exceptions. So just, you know, as always, your best bet each day is to go to Pages, look at all the content I've posted. I'll have it all there so you can kind of check off, you know, what do I need to do today and what's coming for next class. So that's the good news. Let's keep going. So I have here a series of questions that you should use to really think through who your audience is. With your personal narrative, it might benefit you, and this is something that I ask you to do in your journals, and I recognize that I told you you don't have to continue to do the journal, so this will just be Scout's honor. But even if you don't write these questions down, anytime you set out to write something, anything at all, anytime you have a message that you want to deliver, the most effective way for you to communicate that message is to think about these questions. So, number one, ask yourself, who is my audience? It's simple, it's straightforward, but I really want you to dig deep here. Think about, you know, well, is my audience mostly male, mostly female? Is it a blend? How old is my audience? What education level is my audience? What are my audience's interests? Do they all live in one area or region? Are they from one country or another? Really anything, any markers that you can think of to pinpoint who these people are, because you have to get inside their heads if you want to speak to them and if you want them to listen to you. Then consider, is it possible to have multiple audiences? And that is the case. If you think back to the video I showed you the day that we learned about rhetoric, that guy on YouTube who was talking about teens texting and driving, we discussed when we looked at that video that he definitely had two audiences, because we heard examples of him speaking to each. They were comprised of the teen drivers and also the parents of the teen drivers. And again, if you have two distinctly separate audiences, you'd have to find a way to navigate through both of them so that you're able to speak to both of them without maybe, you know, leaving the other out, just finding a way to blend it. Now, because most of the writing you're doing at this stage is based upon assignments, you have to look at your assignment and see if it gives you any clues. If it's open-ended, you can choose the audience that you think is best, those that you think need to hear the message. You might have a situation where, you know, it says, like, I don't know, write a letter to a school board asking for the school board to consider allotting more funding for free lunches or something like that. In that case, you know, your assignment is telling you. So definitely look at assignment instructions. Now, number 4 is really, really important. What does my audience need, want, or value? So again, once you've, in step 1, kind of written out or thought through who the audience is and what makes them unique, now you have to think about, well, what do they value? What do they care about? Conversely, as in the next question, what are they not likely to care about? A good example here would be years back, I had a student who wrote an environmental essay on global warming or climate change, as we now call it, and she opened her piece with this scene of a polar bear, and she was inviting the reader to imagine that they were this polar bear who was out swimming, miles and miles and miles away from shore in search of food, as polar bears do. And eventually the polar bear got very tired, and it was searching for ice to come up and rest on. It finally found a small chunk of ice floating, and as the polar bear climbed up, the ice basically crumbled under its body weight, and then it later drowned because it couldn't come to rest in the way that it was, biologically predisposed to do. Now, I think it was a clever introduction, but the problem is that if her audience is somebody who maybe doesn't buy into climate change or doesn't believe in it, that story isn't likely to motivate them. That story is only going to really resonate with somebody who already probably agrees with, yes, climate change is happening, and also feel strongly for animals. So if you think about this, if you have a group who is that consists of climate change deniers, a group that maybe just doesn't really care about animals or, protecting maybe endangered animals, that isn't going to hold. So really you have to think about, okay, well, if they don't value that, what do they value? Well, they probably value their own lives, their own families, their own livelihoods. So it would be better if you could find an example or an anecdote or a scene that somehow showed them how their comfort and their safety is at stake. Do you see the difference? Next, think about if your audience agrees or disagrees with you. And again, if they agree, your job is a little bit easier. You're probably going to lead more with pathos, as in the example with the polar bear. If you have the animal lovers, if you have the people who understand that climate change is a problem, you can use those type of impassioned examples. But if they don't, you have to find another way. So it's really important to establish, okay, am I preaching to the choir, or, am I trying to make converts up here? Then consider, how can you best organize your information? This should be, again, dictated by who the audience is, what they already know, what maybe they don't know, what they need to know in order to fully understand the issue. So really be thinking about, okay, if I'm in this group of people, does this make sense? Is this what I would need to hear? Then consider, do you have anything to say that might surprise them? I find that if you do have information like that, that can be great for your opening. It also can be helpful if you're trying to get them to think differently, especially if you've got a really high quality source that says something surprising. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, consider, what do you want your audience to assume about you? Your stance naturally should be evident, so please make sure that it's nice and crystal clear in your writing so that they have a firm sense of where your values are and what your purpose is. Now, we've talked about this before. Isn't my instructor my audience? And you guys should already be saying, no, my instructor is not my audience. On a literal level, yes, I am your audience because I am reading what you're doing. But if you think about it, I and all of your other instructors are unique individuals with their own interests, passions, values, skill sets. So depending upon the topic, it may be more or less for each instructor. It just really depends. Now, your instructors should ideally be reading your work, and I certainly do, from the perspective of the audience you have in mind. But remember, it's not your instructor you're writing for, it's this defined group of people who need to hear your message. That's part of that rhetorical triangle we learned about long ago. So, some ways to kind of suss out what your audience needs. Number one, you can look at your assignment criteria. You want to look for those action verbs where it's like summarize, analyze, argue, define. They'll help to give you a sense of, okay, what is it that I'm supposed to do in this essay? And that way you take the right approach. It's important too at this stage that you recognize you don't want to give too many summaries of your research. We've discussed this before. I'm sure that back in high school you were taught that research is simply a means of you collecting information and representing it to your reader. Now that's part of research, but at this advanced stage of writing, research becomes about educating yourself, arming yourself with sound sources, and then showing somebody else using your own understanding, your own point of view, your own conclusions, why that research is pertinent. So the research shouldn't be doing all of the work. I mean, you need it. It needs to be there. But ultimately, this is your show. You need to take center stage and let the research support you as it's meant to do. Also consider you want to avoid including details that could be confusing to the reader. You don't need to go into overly technical definitions or descriptions if that's not what your audience would require. So just think about that. And if you're not sure if you're really speaking to the audience appropriately, it's a great idea to ask a friend to read your writing. Your friend, and it could be a literal friend, it could be a parent, a relative, a teacher, a writing tutor, they probably don't know what it was that you were trying to do in your essay. So when they read it, they can just give you their honest initial opinions, and that way you can see, okay, did I achieve what I wanted to, or maybe I'm making some mistakes along the way. Now, we can't do this because you're not here, and we didn't get to finish these paragraphs either. I ended up scrapping them, but before we left for spring break, we were writing social media paragraphs where I instructed you that we were looking at some of the dangers that could be placed on a young person who's using TikTok. Now, I think that we established, I'm not sure what you were thinking, I'm not sure how far you got into this writing assignment, but I wanted to point out that for this particular assignment, you could have had a couple of different ideas. Number one, you could have been writing directly to the students themselves, those who would be at risk of making some of these mistakes that could jeopardize their health and safety. Okay, and if you were writing to them, you would probably use specific concrete examples to show them, okay, here is the danger, this happened to a real person, this isn't just something that your parents are saying to scare you, and that would leave more of an impression. Now, you also could have been writing to the parents of those children, or possibly school administrators who naturally get kind of drawn into the activity that goes on social media because it happens between students. If you're talking to either of those groups, it might be necessary that you have to do a little bit additional explaining because parents or school administrators or teachers may not be aware of how an app works, what its features are, what its dangers are, and that's the kind of explanation that you wouldn't have to give to the children because they're already using this app. You see the difference? So that's why it matters. That's why you have to think about audience, because your paragraph, if directed to the young people using it, would read a lot differently than if you were directing it to adults and people who deal with these children in school settings. Now, last thing we're going to talk about. See, I promise this wasn't too long. Purpose and audience. Purpose and audience naturally are part of this equation too. They inform, they speak to, or purpose speaks to, why you're doing something and why you've chosen the audience that you've chosen. When you think about it, there really are only three purposes that you could have when you're writing anything, and those are to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. Now, it's also possible that you see evidence of more than one purpose happening in an essay. Like, for instance, in a persuasive essay, you could also be doing informing. You might even be doing some entertaining. But ultimately, your primary purpose is only ever going to be one of these three things. So consider that. You can see under inform, I gave you different, again, action verbs. You might see these in writing assignments. If you see these types of words, then that's a good indicator that you are writing an informational essay versus a persuasive essay. So things like illustrate, classify, compare, analyze, describe, cause effect, etc., etc. Now, I have this final question here. What was your purpose in writing your social media paragraph? And again, your purpose was I asked you to do it, but on a literal level, if you removed that part of the equation, consider, okay, why am I writing this? Why is this important to hear? Purpose is often very closely tied to kairos, so our reason for writing something, it's usually motivated by having conviction for a certain subject, knowing that the subject is pertinent and timely, so those things all play in. What I'm going to do now, because we're done, see, I told you that was pretty easy. I'm going to have you go over to a discussion thread. This is, as I said, how I'll keep attendance. And I'm going to let you guys talk to me about the social media paragraphs that you were forming. I know you didn't finish them, but you could just think through, even if you didn't get to finish them, in your mind, who was your audience and why, and what was your purpose. So you can go contribute to that discussion thread now. Your homework is to read the 2 essays that I mentioned at the beginning of this PowerPoint. Make sure you do your other work. You've still got to complete your storyboards and schedule meetings with Nick Smirker. Complete the discussion from Tuesday if you've not already done that. Complete your agreement quiz and start thinking about your personal narrative. Hopefully that's everything. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will talk to you later. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful day.